Alright, this is going to be a review of the ZWO 294mm Pro. Now, if you've seen my review of the 1600mm Pro, I said that that camera changed the industry. This one hasn't. And there's just really one reason why. Alright, so for those of you that are curious as to why the 1600 has not changed the industry, I'll tell you right up front, it's because of amp glow. Now the 1600 had a relatively, well, mild amp glow. It was actually pretty tepid. You could almost not even notice it was even there. However, the 294 has a very aggressive starburst type looking amp glow, which you have to take darks for or it will show up in your images. And that right there is the reason why this camera really hasn't been a runaway success, which is surprising because the color version of this camera, the 294MC, was actually ZWO's top selling camera for almost 5 years straight. Now, let's go into some of the history of this camera, okay? This camera, it's actually not a 294mm sensor, okay? It's actually a 492 sensor, an IMX 400 number from Sony's development chart, okay? And it's actually an industrial sensor. Now, the two sensors from the color version versus the mono version are very similar. They're close brothers. They're basically cut from the same die in a lot of respects. They have the same kind of amp glow, and they have pretty much the same kind of pixel scale, and they actually have the same number of pixels. However, the 294 is limited in the color version to 11.7 megapixels, whereas the mono version, you actually have two different options. You have a 44 megapixel option and an 11.7 megapixel option. And of course that's because they're two different sensors. Now the 294, if you actually magnify the pixels underneath a microscope, the color version actually has basically a Bayer pattern built into it that is binned 2x2 in hardware, which means that you can't unbin it. In other words, you can't unlock the 44 megapixel resolution of that camera. Now, interestingly enough, the 294 color version has shown up in a couple of consumer cameras, notably the G5S from Panasonic. And that camera was designed for low light work and to work at 4K natively. Now, the 492 sensor here, which we have in the 294mm Pro, I know this is going to get confusing, but anyways, it is an industrial sensor. It's designed for scanning. Now, it's designed very much around the same kind of molds. However, it has the ability to read each and every single pixel individually so that it can work in 8K. Okay? Now, this sensor has almost shown up in a couple of consumer cameras. Blackmagic actually was working on a version of this almost 5 years ago, but they never brought it to market. And there's actually a really simple reason why. And that's because the 492, or the 294mm Pro here, runs a lot hotter, okay? Now, the 1600, on nights when I can get the temperature of this guy down to -20, easily, the 294 struggles to do that. And there's no difference in hardware. These two housings are exactly the same. They have the same kind of Peltier cooler on them. They're the same sensor size. They're both 4/3 sensors. However, this guy produces a lot more heat. And this is one of the reasons why no 8K 4/3 cameras have ever shown up, is because, well, the one sensor that's available out there in 8K for 4/3 just runs too hot. Alright, so let's tip these two guys over here. Another little difference that you might notice between these is that the 1600mm Pro sensor is slightly more square than the 294. And that's because the 294 was designed for a 16:9 aspect ratio. And so this camera right here is designed for video, okay? It's designed to just barely reach 30 frames per second, and it's been 1x1 mode in 8K. Whereas the 1600, it was really designed for photography. This sensor right here, by the way, is the same sensor that shows up in the EM1, the Mark I version, and a couple Panasonic cameras as well. It's now almost 15 years old, and it's still being sold new. Now, do I think that you should buy a 1600 today? Well, let me tell you straight up, the 294 is way more camera than the 1600. And there's only a $200 price difference between the two. In my opinion, buying a 1600 Pro today is a waste of your money. Don't do it. Buy one used. These 1600s can be had for $600 to $700. There are tons of them sold, and lots of people 2600 Pro or the 294. Not very many though to this guy. And that's, you know, because of the amp glow issue. Now, another little thing that's interesting to note about these guys is that the micro lenses on the 1600 were not coated, okay? In other words, they didn't have any anti-reflection coatings on them, and so they cause these weird starburst effects on very bright stars. Now, the 294 does have anti-reflection coatings on them, and so thus, not only do you not get these weird aberrations around really bright stars, but also stars are significantly smaller in the 294. They're so much smaller, in fact, that there's almost no comparison between the two. It's like switching from broadband to narrowband as far as star size goes. Now, I use the 294 not in 8K mode. I exclusively use it in 4K, okay? Bend 2x2 essentially. You know, one of the two readout modes that it's designed for. Now, if you look at the read noise charts of this camera, it's kind of interesting because there are actually two separate ADU units which read the pixels in this camera based on whether or not you're in bin 2x2 or you're in bin 1, 8K versus 4K. And that's because the sensor, which I wish a lot of other sensors would emulate this, is designed to work equally well in either 4K or 8K. So anyways, the read noise of this guy is about 1.5E in 8K. Whereas, now you would think that when you bin it 2x2, it would be 4 times that. Well, it's not. It's actually about 1.3E. It's actually lower. And that's because, well, this thing is using a separate analog to digital converter in order to read off the pixels, which is genius, I think, and I wish more sensors would use something similar to this so that we as photographers could basically pick, okay, I want to sacrifice megapixels in order to get a higher ISO performance essentially. So, kind of a cool feature that I just haven't seen in any other sensors out there besides this one right here. And once again, this is not a camera type sensor, it's an industrial type sensor. Like I said, I use this thing almost exclusively in 4K mode, which means that the well depth in it is about 66,000 photons of light. And let's compare it a little bit with the 1600. So the 1600 has a well depth of about 20,000 photons of light, which means that stars will be dramatically larger in the 1600. You know, also there's the micro lensing issue that I talked about. The 294 or the 492, however you want to call it by its real name or not, has anti-reflection coating, and it's also a backside illuminated sensor, which means that the quantum efficiency of this guy is about 90%, whereas the 1600 is only about 60%. There's also a slight difference in read noise, but there's also the fact that the 294, at least in 2x2 pixel mode, which is 4K, has a significantly larger pixel. It's 4.6 microns versus the 3.75 of the 1600. Now when you add all of these things up, when you add the read noise, when you add the quantum efficiency and the well depth and also the pixel size together, what that essentially means is that 1 hour of exposure time in the 294 is equivalent to 2.6 hours of exposure time in the 1600. Now, that seems like a lot, but you got to remember that there's 10 years difference between these two sensors. You know, this guy here came out in, I think, 2000, 2006, whereas this guy was developed only about 5 years ago. The 1600, in my opinion, don't buy one today. Buy a used one, okay? It's actually a great camera for somebody starting out because of the more tepid amp glow that it has. You can actually kind of get away without taking darks, you know, and actually still get a usable image out of it. Now the 294, you have to take darks with it because, like I said, the amp glow in it is really obvious. And you know, it will really show up in your images, so you've got to take darks with it. Now they're both cooled cameras, which means that taking amp glow onto effect is really, it's going to be invisible once you process it out with your calibration frames. Now that right there is really the only reason why the camera kind of hasn't been a runaway success, and it's also kind of been outshined by the 2600mm, which doesn't require darks. Okay, it has no amp glow in it whatsoever, and you know, that's because this is not a stack sensor. You know, it basically has a chip on the corner of the sensor which is producing lots and lots of heat that creates that amp glow, rather than being spread out across the entire sensor on all these little micropixel spots from a stack sensor's point of view. So do I think that the 294 in today's market is a competitive camera? I actually think it really is an awesome camera. It's extremely versatile. You can use it in 8K, which, you know, allows you to take enormous panoramas of the sky at very high megapixel ratings, okay? Or you can use it in 2x2 with much longer focal length telescopes and still not be oversampled if you're advanced in astrophotography far enough to worry about sampling size. So I think it's a very versatile camera, and really it deserves to be more successful than it has been, just for the sake of the amp glow. It's the only reason. Now, we're all spoiled today by a lot of the amp glow free cameras like the 533, which in my opinion is the ideal starter mono camera out there, or one-shot color for those of you who want to shoot one-shot color. And a lot of people just jump up to the 2600, skipping the 294. However, the 294, I think, still has its place in the industry because of its image circle size. It fits a lot of telescopes well, and it also fits your filters. You know, your 1 1/4 inch filters will work with this sensor quite well. Whereas the 2600, well, you're going to be shelling out a lot more money in filters in order to go to a sensor size that big. You know, the costs go up astronomically. You're going to be looking at double the cost of camera and double the cost of filters versus what you're getting, because you're only getting about 1.5 times more field of view with the 2600 versus the 294. So as the owner of both a 1600 and the 294mm Pro, I gotta say that I'm actually seeing myself almost grudgingly using my 1600 now, because this guy is so much better in just about every single way. Now, he costs twice as much brand new, and these are kind of hard to find used because there just aren't very many that have been sold. Well, I'm thinking about, you know, getting rid of my 1600, which will be sad because I have taken a lot of great pictures of that camera.